fantastic, and thank you all for the emails and chats that you've sent me about the series, and we hope you'll enjoy it over the next 3 weeks. I want to give a little bit of background for how this thing came together. Because of COVID back in March, we were supposed to all meet up at World Agritech in San Francisco, and very quickly, all those plans kind of fell apart. But the silver lining behind all this has been, I've been able to connect with so many of you, via Zoom and other kind of digital methods. And in some ways, it's made these conversations a lot better and a lot more authentic. Seeing your dogs and your kids photobomb our video conferences, seeing your, guest bedrooms and your home offices has kind of, made collaboration in some ways a lot easier. And I've had a lot of great conversations, regarding our industry and what needs to happen to kind of make it more innovative and increase the resiliency of agriculture. And so this came together as part of our way of having some of these really interesting conversations and some of these dialogues. And we want to kind of share this with everybody in a more meaningful medium, such as through online. And so for the first part, of our series, we really wanted to kind of talk about our agricultural system. And to understand how we can create a better ecosystem for innovation, we really have to understand how we got here and what are the challenges, facing agriculture. And with that, we were very lucky to have Alan Bjerga, who is an esteemed journalist and author, and is currently the SVP of Communications with National Milk Producers Federation, join us. Alan, thank you so much for making the time today and for coming on, sharing your experience and go and give us some insight into a little bit of the agricultural system and the development of it here in the U.S. and globally. So to kind of put this into context, and a lot of this is from just my experience in the past 6 months, it feels to me like in agriculture, there's violent agreement that things have to change. If anything, COVID has shown us that we need more resiliency. The past of saying that we can produce the cheapest food most efficiently and get it shipped across the world just doesn't seem to be enough in our modern era. And what the industry and everyone along the supply chain seems to be talking about is we need to have a better food system. And that includes having differentiation. That includes, responding faster to the consumer. That includes better nutrition, that's focused on making sure that agriculture is sustainable, that we can still produce food and crops in the way that we are now with changing climatic volatility and all these environmental challenges that we're facing and ones that we've seen this year. But while that's our goal, the reality really isn't that, at least from our experience and from what we've learned along the supply chain, which is we still have a very fragmented supply chain, despite the fact that, commodities are being produced. There's actually misaligned incentives along that supply chain to kind of meet some of these goals. So Alan, in your book, Endless Appetites, and during your time as a journalist with Bloomberg, you covered a lot of this. So I'm curious if you can maybe share just, for the audience a little bit about how did we get here today? How did the supply chain form?
Sure. First of all, thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak with this group. Having a sense of who is out there, it's exciting to be able to speak to this group of folks who are so passionate about food and agriculture issues and the challenges that the sector faces today. I worked in journalism for 20 years and had the opportunity to meet a lot of folks on a lot of continents with a lot of different ideas of what the food system would be and should be, and part of understanding the future is understanding the past. And one of the things from coming from a fairly non-ideological field was you got an appreciation that usually this is not a world of conspiracies. This is not a world of bad intentions. This is not a world of bad faith. There's a lot of people who perceive certain problems and go seek solutions. I encountered a problem just last weekend, and it actually gave me a little bit of a background for what I'd like to talk about today, which was how our food system got to be what it would be. I was out in Germantown, Maryland last weekend doing something that a lot of folks have done in this COVID-19 era. We were at the U-Pick farm looking at a nice socially distanced way of spending an afternoon. And one of my children picked this apple. And I have to say, these apples are absolutely delicious. And the problem that I found was, well, why did I have to drive to Germantown, Maryland and go pick this apple myself to have an apple this good? Why have I not been able to get apples this good in a grocery store? Who
Mhm.
would not want to go to a grocery store and buy this apple? Well, the problems are basically the problems created by solutions. If you take a look at the evolution of the United States food system, you take a look at the issues that people were facing in earlier times of our history, they had certain problems and they solved solutions. The United States is a vast country with vast transportation networks, clear regions of the country that are better at growing some products than others, a large population, a great desire for economy of scale, but markets that sometimes are not so close to those food sources as they could be.
Mhm.
One of the areas I talk about in my book is the development of futures trading and the Chicago Board of Trade, and the
Mhm.
need in the early days of American history for people to be able to acquire foodstuffs they could trust. In other words, food they could not see.
Mhm.
Far from the sort of more locally based agrarian societies we had is you had an urbanizing population in a vast country with vast resources like the United States, where you could transport things inexpensively from point A to point B. You needed ways to ensure uniformity, ways to ensure consistency, so that if you were buying something from someone you had never actually met, you could trust that product. You
Mhm.
saw that rise of markets from taking that place. Another issue, of course, was food safety. You take a look at mid 19th century New York in the era of swill milk, adulterated milk products that killed thousands of people. You needed to have, again, that trust, that consistency, that uniformity to make people believe that this was something that was safe. So the priorities that sprung up around the United States food system quite naturally were transportability, which means long shelf life. It means phytosanitary safety, which means verifiable procedures. Certain uniform graded standards, which means that your food should all sort of be a certain way.
Mhm.
Those are all things at which the United States food system has succeeded wildly. You take a look at the development of the modern supermarket and the incredible variety of food that you have there, and it's the least expensive food in the world, and it comes from all over the place.
Mhm.
But it doesn't taste like this apple. Why is that? Well, what factors did I just tell you about in terms of what was important in the development of the US food system? What was something that I didn't name? Taste. We like something that would taste good, but that really wasn't the big thing that was looked for as that food system took place. And so
Mhm.
now we have this legacy of, and it's been talked about before, you can get an amazing variety of tomatoes in a US supermarket. But how good are they? Consumers
Mhm.
have noticed this, and part of why they've noticed this is another factor I would point into in recent development of food systems: globalization. Um, I have a lot of family in the European Union. I'm married into the European Union. And when I go to the European Union, I often find myself being the defender of American food system and American food practices. And they ask, why is this food so tasteless? Why is American food not so good? And of course, my back gets up because I'm now the representative of the United States, and I say, "There's great food in America. Just come to America. We have great food." But when I do go to the European Union, I often do find that there's some pretty darn good food there. Well, how did their food system develop? The Schengen zone and free trade across European countries is a fairly recent phenomenon.
Mhm.
Frankly, some things that were the disadvantages of the European Union in some ways were advantages in other ways in terms of creating tastier food. Some of the more localized food networks with a higher priority of freshness, or at least greater ability of freshness, varieties that maybe not be quite so easy to transport, well, those varieties were allowed to survive and thrive, frankly, because transportation was prohibitively often expensive anyway. If you were designing a United States of Europe, would all of these growing regions necessarily be as effective and as spread out as they are now? Would everything move to the Mediterranean coast, and another part would specialize in Ukraine or some other system that would take place? Again, these are not factors of right or wrong or better or worse.
Mhm.
Again, people in the European Union spend a lot more food for of their dollars for food than they do in the United States. Again, that inexpensive quality was not allowed to be emphasized in the same way or to be as successful. The resources were not there. again, these food systems have evolved as a result of people making decisions based on their circumstances, trying to solve the problems at hand. The problem we face now, of course, are solutions can beget more problems. You hear a lot of discussions in agriculture and food right now about sustainability, about carbon emissions, about food miles. You hear discussions about obesity. You hear about discussions about, again, taste. You hear discussions about what is relatively cheaper for one product versus another product. All of these problems are the results of what were previously considered solutions. Remember during the space age, I'm old enough to remember some of the children's books written in the wake of the space race. All sorts of high-tech products like Tang were considered the wonder foods of their era. I grew up drinking a lot of Kool-Aid. Kool-Aid was a pretty amazing concentrated thing. Did all that high fructose corn syrup have the impact that was foreseen? I will leave others to answer that question, but I think a lot of people in this audience would probably be suspecting what the issues would be. When you talk about this apple, it's also important to remember what the problems are and what the problems are not. There's a lot of debate about pesticides and about GMOs and such. This apple is not as good tasting as it is because it is GMO free, although GMO apples are incredibly rare. I have no idea what was sprayed on this apple, but this is not an organic apple, and I guarantee you that the folks who run this farm certainly find ways to keep the pests away. Those are not the concerns in this necessary sphere of answers to questions. So first you have to figure out what the problems are. I think everyone has agreed that there are problems. Then people have to decide what there are for solutions. But I think the lessons of the past do hold some hope for the future, especially if we are mindful of what problems are and what aren't. Get back to the original assertion. The food system that we have today was not the result of conspiracy. This was not a desire to do harm. This was not a set of bad actors in bad faith. These were people who isolated problems. These were people who found solutions. Yes, those solutions begat more problems, but in some ways they were actually wildly successful at doing some things that at the time were incredibly important public priorities. We can do this again if we get into more of a problem-solving mode rather than a recrimination mode, rather than a conspiratorial mode, to understand the backgrounds and expertise that people bring to problems and agree on some common solutions. We are at a point where, at least in the mainstream scientific community and in much of popular thought as well, if you take a look at surveys, that we do have issues with sustainability, that there are things that should not be done the same way, that there is an obesity problem and that better nutrition should be emphasized, that there does need to be more variety in diets, and that sometimes the alignment between what is cheap and what is good is out of whack. Together, we can solve some of these problems of the present day into the future with the same spirit of the problems of the past, understanding that infrastructure has been inherited, that we're living in the planet that we're living in, that some change is going to be very difficult and often very controversial. However, solutions can be sought with that good faith, with that intelligence, and with that clear-eye understanding of the problems that are to come.
So Alan, you made a great point. You're saying that the same approach from the past can be taken, in the future with that right attitude. But you made a very interesting distinction, which is that at the time when we're trying to solve these issues, this infrastructure didn't really exist, right? And that these incumbents didn't really exist. And, the predecessors of who now run these major companies and who really operate the supply chain were a very different group of people with very different incentives. That mandate was there. Do you really feel that, with how large our food system has gotten and with how entrenched, these incumbents are, do you feel like we can actually repurpose what we've made with just vision alone? Or does the flexibility and nimbleness required, to make these changes have to come from a new system? And what I mean by that is, if you think about, the world I come from, which is soybeans, even though, farmers grow the soybeans and then, a processor processes them, and then that soybean is consumed by various, groups, our protein companies, our alt protein companies, and then ultimately by us as consumers. But the consumer, and what they want and what's driving that, kind of consumption, or even what the protein producers want versus what, the oil producers want versus the processors, the seed companies, all the way back to the genetics, these have become very, very large incumbents, with very established infrastructure and investor pressure, right? So they're expected to utilize, that capacity, that return on investment, et cetera. And they built up the system, as you've said, for efficiency, for scale, for global footprint. How do they change direction? Are they allowed to do it incrementally, or do they just not have the flexibility to do it anymore?
Well, first of all, you're not going to tear it all down and start over again. I mean, it just things don't work that way. There are too many jobs that are lined up on that. And again, there's actually a lot of negative involved in that sort of an approach because, I mean, people do have a lot of variety of foods at a supermarket and they are able to cheaply and efficiently feed themselves. And we forget that up until maybe even a generation ago, starvation in this world was a much bigger problem than obesity. And unfortunately, again, in some recent trends, food insecurity is making a pretty strong comeback in this world. So we can't forget that, some of the things that we see as problems, again, are actually solutions to things we're not thinking about so much anymore. We have to be mindful of that. Now, I think the question, first of all, you're not going to simply dismantle things. So the question then becomes, and this is what you're alluding to, is how fast can change occur? How much can you steer this ship? How much are you able to, not even so much retrofit, but repurpose some of these things to solve the problems of the present day? I think it certainly can be done. The question is it fast enough? And I'm probably not going to be the last time this comparison is being made, but real instructive metaphor simply because it's actually a smaller system, but one everyone understands about. Take a look at the energy system and how we do transportation in this world. We are not able to simply take every gas station in America and turn it into an electric charging station. And even if you did, where's that electric energy source ultimately coming from, right? So would you even solve the problem if you did that? We are so embedded in this fossil fuels based economy that you can't get out. But undeniably progress has been made. We're in a better space. We're in a better space now than we were 20 years ago. I mean, it's not just the Toyota Prius, it's Tesla. And these are a couple different models that are all moving toward this direction. The big concern, of course, is that you still have behemoths and you still have this legacy economy that is not necessarily moving fast enough. I think the question for the food system is moving fast enough. Change can occur. The question is, what incentives do you put in place? What sort of consciousness do you have? What sort of alternatives can you agree to that allows some of the challenges that we have at hand to be faced quickly enough and forcefully enough to be truly meaningful? Can you go far enough, fast enough?
So Alan, let me ask you this. I'll give you an example. So this is a recent conversation I had about sustainability. So the idea that if we could produce crops in a more sustainable way, and that, let's say, carbon footprint or benefit is passed on to the consumer, from what we're hearing, from market research, is saying, I would pay more for that because I know that this is an initiative I care about. But somewhere along the way, between what that consumer wants and who grows that crop, the farmer is saying, I would love to do this because for me, it is all about diversity away from being paid on one metric. Let's just say it's yield. Sure. I would love to be paid on more diversified metrics because that's going to improve my operations. That's going to improve my resiliency. And so when we talk about the resiliency of agriculture, we talk about it from a sustainability standpoint, but we should also talk about it from an economic standpoint. We only have 2% of our population who produce all of our food in the U.S. and possibly for a lot of the world. And they hire labor and they invest in the land and they are stewards of this land. But if they continue to be put under pressure economically, then our food system is not going to be sustainable because more and more people are going to move away from it. So farmers are saying, look, we're already under a lot of duress and we would love to be paid on this. And consumers are saying, well, we want to reward those farmers that are making the better decisions. However, somewhere along the supply chain, though, a processor, a Bunge, a ADM or Cargill, well, right now, at least, their initiatives for sustainability are just within those four walls. So we're driving down our energy costs, we're increasing our water use efficiency, but we're really not segmenting, to reward the best growers to give us the best crops, which we then pass on to the consumer and get value for that. So what I'm hearing is there's violent agreement, but there's not enough of that motivation either economically in order to capture it. And sustainability is just one of those examples, but I think there's other ones, like you said, nutrition, taste, differentiation. So
Right.
where does that pain point occur? Where does that pain point have to go to for that, kind of adoption to be more rapid? And where does it best come from? So we talk about consumers, but where do you think it really has to come from to galvanize this change that we need?
So let me tell just an anecdote from actually my current life, working with National Milk Producers Federation, because the dairy sector has just in the past year unveiled what it's called its net zero commitment to be carbon neutral by 2050. It's an industry-wide goal, but a lot of the emphasis, and part of this is my own area because I'm ultimately paid by the dairy farmers. It really, a lot of it starts on the farm, right? I mean, when you're taking a look at carbon emissions, water use and such, it's all about environmentally sustainable practices. One of the challenges toward getting to net zero by 2050, however, is the farmers may have a will to do it, and there may even be a way to do it, but these guys have got to stay in business. So, a dairy farmer, she or he is going to be looking at this goal and say, okay, this is great, but how do I get there? Well, you have to create subsidiary industries of ecosystem services. You need a carbon trading program so that, there is actually a value for what you are creating. You need public policy incentive problems. One of the most powerful things you can do in dairy is give every farmer a methane digester, which takes methane, for which dairy is roundly criticized from an emissions standpoint, and gets rid of it, or turns it into, something useful. The idea being that, again, you're going to be net zero. It also leads to some rethinking of the sector, and in some ways that makes people kind of uncomfortable. If you are trying to be a net zero dairy farm, there's a feeling that small is good, but honestly, the larger farms are the ones that are able to make the capital investments that can make this possible. So if you want to save the small farm in a net zero environment, you've got to create those policy incentives to allow them to compete. Otherwise, this is, in terms of making the environment more sustainable, now there's a social goal that a lot of people who also want sustainability share that isn't being reached. And that's where I say solutions can beget more problems. But getting back to net zero, that is a sector-wide pledge, and it's done. There's of course a corporate social responsibility belief to it. A belief that this is a good thing to do for the planet, but it's also considered smart business, and part of that is because of consumer pressure, because of regulatory pressure potentially, because of the need as populations get more dense and dairy farms tend to be closer to urban centers. Everybody wants to get along. So there's proactive and there's reactive and there's commercial motivations and there are idealistic motivations, just like every problem-solving effort. But it is possible because there is this recognition of the need, and it is across the sector, and it is wanted from farm to fork. But now the question becomes, okay, how do you get there and how do you meet that goal? And I'll also be honest with you as well. The net zero goal is 2050. There's a lot of hope that it can be sooner than that. And why is there the hope for that? Because again, you're wondering how much you can do, how fast to make sure that it's meaningful.
Okay. Well, Alan, you also mentioned a really interesting point about this, about, big versus small. If you were looking at the value chain right now with a lot of very large players and some smaller players, there seems to be a lot of antagonism, and we draw these very divisive lines, unfortunately. Small is organic, it's family friendly, it's not big business, and it has that image. And then large is these idea of corporate farms, race to the bottom,
right,
profit at all costs. And again, like you said earlier, those are all mischaracterizations of where the industry is going. And part of the challenge is that it seems like this idea of segmentation and fragmentation, if you will, is very antagonistic. Is that the marketing differences, of what ag and food has become, it's more divisive than unifying. So in other words, rather than saying we're trying to create a number of tiers of products that fit different consumers and we're cohabitating, it seems like when we also talk about differentiation, it comes with the idea that one is better or even one is safer, et cetera, rather than saying, we're producing as many different products for as many different people. And a lot of farmers I know produce conventional and they produce organic. And from their standpoint, it's an economic exercise, but they treat their land, they treat the quality all the same. They want to produce the best crop possible. I think that is a major issue with, beyond the infrastructure challenges with adaptation and adoption of innovation is how do you view, how do you overcome the prejudices of all of these, various systems so that they can work together? How do you think we can overcome that?
I think a lot of the issues that you face in agriculture is certain people, for various reasons, they feel like they're disrespected. I mean, farmers are people, right? Marketing departments are made up of people. C-suites are made up of people, and all of them want to be respected for the work that they do and the contributions they make. And farmers uniformly are very proud of the role that they have in feeding the public and feeding the world. And so for someone to come who has no background in farming and maybe read some book that, of various provenance and says, hey, I don't respect you because I think that you are the problem, the farmer will say, well, no, I'm part of the solution. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I feel like an approach that says, yes, you are part of the solution. Thank you for being part of the solution. We're actually working on this problem, and here's how you can help. Mm-hmm. I have yet to meet a farmer who did purely malevolent things for the world. I mean, it's almost impossible to perceive. I mean, if nothing else, agriculture by nature creates something useful, much more useful than a lot of the folks I've seen with jobs in Washington, D.C. and what they've been doing over the years. So by definition, agriculture has value because you are producing something of value. Mm-hmm. And the question simply becomes, okay, this does this. How could it also do this? Because this is a goal that we can all get behind. And this is not a threat, and this is not an aspersion, and this is not an attempt to put you out of business. In fact, we will work with you to find ways to make your business thrive. Mm-hmm. But for these reasons, we do have to reach to this goal, and we're really hoping you can help. And that's the conversation that is taking place in the more enlightened sectors of agriculture every day, because you have supply chain concerns. You have vendors and folks further up who want to be assured that the products that they're getting are produced to certain standards that they know their consumers will feel good about. So you're having that pressure coming from the consumer end of the chain. Then you have, again, premium differentiation of product, which is always making, a farmer look at a different area as far as revenue streams. So there's that pressure as well. But farmers are also very proud of what they're doing. And somebody coming in and saying, well, you're wrong, do all this differently. Mm-hmm. Humans react to that defensively. And now if this is your land and your livelihood, it's probably not going to work that well. But there are approaches that are successful. And I think you have seen a lot of understanding and a lot of acceptance of some of the issues that face the world today within agriculture, much more so now than even 10, 15 years ago.
So post-COVID world, where we are today, when you think about now the awareness around food security, the awareness now around efficiency possibly not being a problem, but a solution. If you were to identify along the commodity supply chain from, let's just say, all the way back from genetics, innovation, through to the consumer, if you had to just say the top three things, top three breaks, if you will, in that supply chain, the top three gray areas, missing pieces that need to change, whether that's innovation, infrastructure, or even incentives, what would you say that those top three things are in order to create a more harmonized system that we seem to all want to work towards? What are the three things that you think need to really happen?
So let's flash back to late March. For folks in the United States, how easy was it to get a gallon of milk in your grocery store? Maybe easier than toilet paper. But there were a lot of runs. And I think that I mean, talk about a powerful wake-up call for the agricultural supply chain to a consumer. I mean, literally, one thing in the United States you never had to worry about was the food not being there.
Yeah.
And you saw it in dairy, and you saw it in meat. You saw it in certain produce areas and spotty situations.
Yeah.
And so certainly general knowledge of agricultural supply chain issues were pretty high. And if you take a look at areas that got highlighted, this is a slightly different answer to your question, but I will give you three examples, and I do think it will be at least pertinent. Um, I think you're going to have in the future a lot more attention to diversity of supply sources.
Mm-hmm.
Again, when the nodes are so centralized, when they don't work out, you got yourself some problems, and that was one area that was going on. Another area was workers. There's a lot more awareness of how essential the folks are who are just involved in the agricultural supply chain, and their health and safety and conditions, I think, are going to become a bigger issue for consumer concern than there has been before. Sustainability is also, I think, a big deal in the aftermath of COVID-19, but I wouldn't say that was really contributed to necessarily because of the supply chain disruptions that took place. Food didn't stop showing up shelves because, of decades-long trends toward climate change. I mean, if anything, all the stay-at-home orders gave the planet a break for a couple weeks.
Yeah.
But I do think that this environment has just raised a greater awareness of the idea, and this is certainly backed by public opinion surveys, that we got problems, folks. There are some epic things going on. And if we've learned one thing from COVID-19, it's that sort of the slower long-term degradation of capacities in areas like public health can bite you in some really dramatic ways.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it easier to relate on an issue like climate change, where, I mean, you could argue that there are people fleeing wildfires and hurricanes right now who are feeling some pretty dramatic impacts. But certainly that awareness of, some of this long-term stuff really can become immediate, very unexpectedly, and very quickly. And perhaps these things that we didn't really have to deal with till tomorrow, maybe tomorrow has arrived and we need to deal with some things. And I think that would be a third area that has been highlighted by recent crises.
Okay. And to be more positive, if you were to say, what do you believe that you're seeing in the changes that are already existing, that get you really excited, Alan? I mean, are you seeing some things where it's more than just lip service, that it's not just to appease the consumer or, or the broader, shifts in, kind of consumer preference, but you're seeing some real substantial changes that you feel like improves food resiliency overall?
I actually, and once again, I'm going to sound like a shill for my sector, but what I see within dairy and its stewardship commitment and its net zero initiative and its carbon and water goals, that is a very positive thing, because it doesn't have to be. I mean, you'll hear about dairy being challenged by vegan products and the alt milks and all of these different categories. The alt milks aren't even milks. Be very clear about that. They are beverages. Milk is the product of a lacteal secretion, thank you. And we will fight very hard for the hard work of our dairy farmers. But the fact is milk is still in 94% of grocery shelves, and the alts could take a good amount of market share. And I mean, milk is going to continue to exist. But there's a very strong recognition of the issues that are faced in the world, and a very proactive approach toward facing them, because you definitely want to be part of the solution, not the problem, because problems do eventually get solved, and you don't want to be the thing that gets solved out of existence. Everything is a mix of proactive and reactive, and what you are seeing in some of these dairy commitments, because this is a sector that gets dinged for carbon emissions and contributions to negative contributions to the planet, really showing that no, this is a problem that's going to be solved, and we're going to be part of what is being solved, and it doesn't have to happen and the commitments from farmers and folks who are looking at other things day to day wouldn't have to be doing it. But there is this recognition, and gosh darn it, it will lead to real outcomes. The question is far enough and fast enough.
Very interesting. And by the way, while we've been speaking, Alan, we've had a lot of questions come in. So, and I think these are great ones. So I'm going to shift a little bit and maybe take some of these questions that are coming in through our portal. The first one's from Naveen, CEO of Terviva. So he's asking, what is the role of farmers in the journey to communicate on innovation? I think what Naveen's pointing at is, we advocate, a lot, for our own technologies, and we advocate a lot for the role of agriculture. And I know for myself, at least, sometimes feels like, we get thundering applause because it's an echo chamber, and you kind of go outside of, the immediate industry, and it becomes very different. And because, like you said, the supply chain is so long for agriculture, it's not like even pharmaceuticals where, you make the drug gets to the consumer, and then you can talk about all the health benefits or the side effects, yikes, etc. In agriculture, it's so big, so fragmented, so many different players that often your message gets lost along the way. And so whether it's the farmer or whether it's the industry overall, how do we become better at communicating, and making that voice heard or preserving that message along the supply chain?
So farmers are the best communicators because they're the most credible communicators. And that's why, again, I've been based in Washington, D.C. for many years, and I have seen many organizations try to claim the mantle of the American farmer because they know the American farmer is a heck of a lot more popular than they are. And I think a lot of folks really want to know what the farmers think too, because a lot of people are making money off of the farmer's product, and they want to know what the farmer actually thinks about this. And farmers do tend to be pretty skeptical of people who don't get dirt under their fingernails coming out of the farm and saying, no, really, you should do it this way. So it's essential for initiatives to succeed to have farmer buy-in, which means farmers have to see what the interest is that serves them, not just the person who's telling them they should be doing A, B, or C. And then have, again, effective solutions to problems that are based on their problems. Now, sometimes I almost think that there can this is not necessarily an issue that I don't think hasn't been recognized. And in fact, if you take a look at things like biotech, I think the farmers, pretty clearly saw the problems that were being solved from biotech at the very beginning. The issue there was that the consumers never really saw how this was helping them, and that's where that particular credibility battle started to rage. So you have to be paying attention to the full supply chain, but the farmer's essential. It may not work. You may not have a successful initiative or public campaign or industry-wide persuasion effort. You may not have it with them, but you definitely will not have it if you don't have them.
No, that's a great point. And, so the farmer, I agree, is the core. And, some of the misconceptions is this idea of corporate farms. It's actually very large family farms. Like corporate farms, I think, are single digits in the US. You have large farmers and you have small farmers. But one thing I am concerned about, is the farmer continues to be the independent voice of advocacy. He makes independent decisions every year on what seeds he buys. And he's not going to do anything that's going to be detrimental to his land, the health of his family, et cetera. And I think that adds a lot of credibility. But in the US, at least, we are seeing more of a rural-urban divide. Less and less people understand where their food is coming from. So even though there's the voice of the farmer, that voice is so far removed and in a way that might not be as salient or as apparent to the urbanite, living in the cities. How do we add more voices along the supply chain, if you will, to then further that connection so that people feel like it's a message that makes it more relatable to them?
It's an unfortunate phenomenon that I have seen in these social media aware driven times, of confrontation. You have a lot of farmers, that they feel like they're just being picked on by people who are ignorant. And what you see is a lot of that frustration boiling over, and then it goes the other way. It becomes a disrespect for a consumer who, they know that they're making a choice and they want to make sure that it's a choice that they feel good about. And guess what? They're the customer, right? And in the end, you are serving the customer. And sometimes there's not a sufficient recognition or mindfulness toward that circumstance that you can see in some parts of agriculture, frankly. And that's difficult. That's a difficult thing to talk about within agriculture. But getting back to the whole supply chain, one of the most powerful things about farmers is that there's a lot of desire, even in urban areas, about supporting rural communities and making sure that this entire country is healthy. And again, countless rural communities supported by agricultural operations, regardless of the size, because that large farm is also then a large employer. These are still economic engines and drivers, and this is important work. And this is work that builds better for everyone. And getting back to these COVID related lessons, that greater awareness of all the steps of the supply chain, I think makes people realize on all ends of it that they are part of a more collective effort that will succeed and fail based on the health of all the components, because it falls apart if one falls apart.
Interesting. Let me see here. We have another question from Scott Bryson. And Scott's asking, can the system be transitioned by using large-scale advanced purchase agreements to improve sustainability, reduce volatility, and provide long-term stability for farmers? And I think that's a great question. That's something that we've been thinking about a lot. As a seed company, we've been kind of thinking of, is the farmer truly our customer, or is the farmer more of a partner to innovation? Because when I look at the seed industry, for instance, and again, you talked about this and you touched on it earlier, Alan, which was biotech hasn't really benefited the consumer, right? And, I know among my peers, traditionally it's been, well, the consumer, we don't really deal with them. Every year we develop traits or technologies in biotech and we sell them to farmers, and the farmers let us know if that is valuable or not. They say that has that reduced our cost of input, has that, improved our yields? And that's who we're really trying to answer to. And we kind of ignored everyone down the chain, and that's left a gap in communications. And again, that's been filled with a lot of misinformation, unfortunately. But one thing that's true about this is, every year, the big companies say, well, we want to sell seed to the farmer. And as commodity prices drop, but input costs continue to increase, that's putting a bigger and bigger burden on the farmer, and we're kind of leaving that farmer out there to fend for himself by saying, well, here's your cost of goods sold, go out there, fend for yourself. Do you think there has to be a better relationship where the farmer is thought of more as a partner? Because ultimately, the farmer is a means of production to get these crops out there for then, other consumers to either consume directly, or its animal feed, or its inputs into ingredients. Is there a way for us to, increase the resiliency by changing that thinking of the farmer's role in that supply chain?
Sounds like you got some partnerships to build. I think I think you outlined it pretty eloquently, right? It's farming has always been a very difficult business, and the cliche has always been, the farmer is a price taker. The farmer is not a price maker. And how do you change that relationship so that it's not necessarily the end product that the farmer is simply getting, and the company ends up, I don't want to say killing the golden goose, but somebody's still got to grow this stuff, and there's a lot of expertise out there, and you need to be kind to that. And perhaps that attitude of partnership that you are discussing is one way to get toward it. But I guess that would be the problem that you would need to be solving, and certainly worth another conversation.
Well, thank you. It's a monumental task, and it's really the theme that we're talking about overall in the series. And for this first part, Alan, is I put on my ZCal hat for a second, and I think of this as, well, we're a very small innovator, right? We have very limited resources. I think we have some really cool technologies, really cool IP. And if this was plug and play, or this was like an app where you just download it on your phone, I wouldn't worry about it as much. But when you're talking about changing an entire supply chain and relationships as an innovator, it becomes extremely hard. So it kind of asks that question, the chicken and the egg is, does the innovation drive the change in the system, or does the system have to drive the change, or does the system have to be set up to adopt innovation? Because, if you look at the entire ecosystem, if I were to go out and try to raise money for a new innovation, an investor is going to kind of ask us, well, what, how will this technology be used? Who's going to buy it? And if I say to them, well, actually, this supply chain is very, very different, and you don't really get paid on these factors, but they're really important, and there's an economic value there, but it's not being captured. You're going to get shown that door pretty quickly, right? And
Right.
I'm not going to raise money, and a lot of the innovation is going to go away. But without that innovation, the big companies or the incumbents or the supply chains or whatever you want to call it, they're kind of going to just say, well, this innovation doesn't exist. So why am I going to change the system based on some blue sky, prospects? So,
Well,
I mean,
somebody on that supply chain has to understand the intangible value and make it a tangible one. Someone, somewhere, someplace. And is that the consumer? Is that the retailer? Is that the processor? Somebody's got to make some value somewhere. Is it the public policy official who has decided that this is the social goal? I mean, you're not going to get people to do things, especially when they're struggling just to meet their own ever thin margins, to do something just because it's the good thing to do. But there are a lot of levers and pressure points that when one thinks creatively, if you really believe in that there's a problem that can be solved, there should be some way to tangibly translate that. Now that's the challenge to find that. But one area that is hopeful is that, there are several actors that can help find ways to create that desire. That's the whole reasoning behind certification programs, right? I mean, what is the value of the Rainforest Alliance label other than to have consumers who are encouraged that farmers or somebody on the supply chain undergo some practice that otherwise wouldn't have value? Same thing with incentives from the public policy standpoint. Farmers do all sorts of environmentally great things. There's a federal program that creates an incentive for that otherwise wouldn't be there. Somewhere somebody, high oleic soybeans. Okay, there's an example in terms of creating markets for something that has some tangible benefit that theoretically somebody's going to want to buy because that's going to give them the value add. And I'm seeing it, starting at the end customer. I don't know if it starts at the end customer or not, but it has to start somewhere.
And what I worry about in that comment, Alan, is the inconsistency of timing and how long it takes for anything to happen in agriculture. And I'll give you kind of an example of this. We just recently spoke with, a large, pork producing company, millions heads of swine. And they were saying to us that over the past few years, the percentage of soybeans used in their diet has just continued to drop, because it's doesn't have the same protein content that it used to. And they're saying, look, we've had to move away. We've moved on to corn DDGS, and we've moved on to synthetic amino acids because we're the 80-90% consumer of soy, as an industry, and we have no voice in how this innovation happens or what kind of quality there is. And they said, we're not antagonistic to the farmer. We feel bad for the farmer. He's getting paid on bushels, dollars per bushel and bushels per acre. But what we really want, are protein. What we really want are amino acids. What we really need to understand is nutritional profile. So really tangible benefits. And yet, the soy farmer is getting pressured because of that drop in the value. He's feeling pressured because, a reliable feed source is no longer there. And this year, it was an even more draconian decision because ethanol completely shut down as fuel prices tanked. And all of a sudden, there was no corn DDGS. And so, from his standpoint, he's like, as as a farmer, as a swine producer, I'm very worried about the livelihood of the soybean farmer. And I know that my actions right now, moving away from soy, is probably going to affect, him to a certain degree. But if this goes away, then we're both kind of screwed. But again, the changes necessary and the timelines necessary just don't seem to line up, because
Right.
innovation ag takes years, decades, and yet you
Right.
guys are worried about what's happening this quarter.
Because in theory, I mean, the market would eventually take care of this, right? I mean, you would either come up with some sort of incentive for a higher protein soybean that leads to resurgence that would get developed, or eventually soybeans, frankly, would wither, but something else would take its place, and the market would adjust. But you're dealing with folks with problems in the here and now, and there is no easy solution to that. You know, but you identify kind of a problem, and I don't know what technology is or what takes place.
Yeah, and Alan, I think there's technologies out there among a number of companies, whether that's alternative protein sources, new crops.
Sure.
We're seeing a lot of great ones coming along, and we are seeing innovation to try to refocus on improving or restoring the nutritional content of our major row crops. But again, by the time we realize the problem and the time for innovation to happen, I mean, there could be years in the middle where consumers and societies, bear that cost. And that's my point. It's not like we can just turn on and off the light switch, for innovation to happen. This has to be a very, kind of long-term vision and commitment to research. And, what we're seeing more broadly, and this is, again, themes that we want to explore, not only this part, but throughout the series, is, are the basics of our innovation fundamentals being eroded? And as we talked about it from this first part, which is, if the supply chain doesn't change, if the system doesn't change to incentivize the type of innovation necessary right now, we're not going to meet the challenges that are arising in the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah. I would just, and maybe, I know we're running low on time, so there's not much more to add, but just one thought, and this is actually because I this chat going down the side, and I'm reading this support company providing takeoff agreements based on protein content. It raises a really important point, is one way to quickly solve a problem is to be very good about what figure them is. Right here, the problem you've identified for the soy grower is that they're not really in a soybean market. They're in a protein market. Yeah. And so if you start buying off of, I need this much protein rather than I need these soybeans, now this person is growing for protein rather than for soy. Could lead to a much bigger pea crop up on the northern plains, for all I know. There could be some adjustments, but once you figured out what the problem is, you do find a solution in a quicker time frame than if you were struggling because, well, I'm having this problem, but how can I solve it? Well, because you're thinking about the wrong problem rather than identifying the correct problem and then seeking the most efficient solution. Just a thought. I mean, if we found all the solutions, then I guess that once the series is over, agriculture is going to be fixed. But I don't think that's going to be the case. But I think that the conversation is going to be really interesting, and we'll probably come out of it ahead of where we started, and that's progress.
Very good. We're going to take one last question here, and it's from Ingrid, and she says, do you think there would be a move to more regional supply / distribution models in ag now they're more aware of how global supply chains being impacted by disruptions like COVID? So in other words, Alan, you made a great point, early on, which is, let's not throw efficiency out the window. If anything, the COVID might be reminding us that efficiency is going to be more important with our growing population. And, like you said, obesity has been a shorter term challenge than starvation has been. But do you think that we can have both? That there can be efficiency and resiliency? That, there can be the economies of scale, if you will, but the flexibility to shift supply chains? Because, at the end of the day, I feel like efficiency and resiliency actually might be, the same thing in some ways, because what agriculture faces now is, with our population today and basically every challenge we face as humanity being a global problem, whether that's, climatic volatility, whether that's pandemics in the future. I mean, these are going to be global problems regardless. So that efficiency might actually be the same as resiliency going forward. You see that connecting?
I think that's a very shrewd point, because what exactly is efficient? Not being able to get hamburger in a grocery store because the plants are closed down because they're all concentrated in this one part of the country isn't particularly efficient or resilient. I don't think that necessarily we move to an artisanal eat local food fantasy world, as much as look, there are a lot of desirable aspects to that sort of a system. I mean, look, I got this apple, all right, but I do think that this is not just true in agriculture. This is true in the ability to have adequate supplies of masks and oil to put for your hand sanitizers. There is definitely a belief that there needs to be a little more redundancy in the system and a little more diversity and robustness in the supply chain, because in some areas we've just become really too centralized, in particular relying on one thing to come through and realizing there are now scenarios where that thing doesn't come through. And I think that type of resiliency in the chain is going to be what's considered efficient in the future, because you've realized that you have to be mindful of ever more extreme scenarios. And the way you do that is by spreading your bets. And that's going to mean a little bit more regionalization in food systems. I think you can see that.
Wonderful. Well, we are coming to the end of the hour. So, thanks everyone for the great questions. And again, Alan, thank you as always for the lively conversation. Really appreciate all of your insights. And again, maybe just as a quick summary and takeaway, things are not as bad as they seem. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but we've overcome greater challenges in the past. And it sounds to me like you're saying we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just got to polish up the chrome a little bit and start adapting to our new system?
I think we probably need a little bit of engine work.
A little bit of engine work as well.
Right, but I think we have the tools, and I think we can locate the right parts. And as long as we don't argue over which wrench is better than the other wrench, we'll probably get some necessary repairs done.
Excellent. Well, Alan, again, thank you very much. And again, thank you everyone for registering for the event. Next week, we're going to move on to part 2, and we're going to actually take a look at another sector, which is the cannabis sector. And our goal in next week is to really think about, can we take some lessons from our adjacent cousins in the cannabis and hemp space about how they've built an entire supply chain almost overnight, with a very different culture, with a very different, group of actors, but still, at the end of the day, it's still agriculture trying to grow a different crop, and see what lessons we could take from there to possibly accelerate the pace of innovation and adoption in agriculture. So again, thank you everyone for the time, and we hope you'll join us next week as well. And again, Alan, appreciate all your insights.
Thank you.